Story a lot of you will feel very strongly about. It's about a man called Russell Causley. He was sentenced to life in prison after being convicted of murdering his wife. That was Carol Packman, the year 1985.
Despite refusing to reveal what he did with Carol's body, Causley has now been granted parole and is expected to be released from prison early next month.
OK. It's a decision that has left those closest to the case distraught. And today we're joined by Carol's grandson, Neil Gillingham. Neil, I think a lot of people can see the evilness of all of this, the injustice of all of this. How does it actually feel to be close like that and know that this man will be out and no one is any closer to finding your grandmother's body?
It's an absolute travesty. It's an absolute travesty, it genuinely is. And it came as a complete shock. It genuinely did, given my grandfather's behaviour over the recent years, in terms of how he's acted and some of the stories and accounts that he's given in terms of what he did with my grandmother, which, for anybody watching this and who has watched the Investigator British Crime Story, will be able to see for themselves, is pretty horrendous and quite grisly, to be honest with you.
But there is a law. There is this new law, this Helen's Law, which, as I understand it, for the first time makes it a legal requirement to consider withholding of information when making a decision whether to release an offender. So in this particular case, is the considering over?
Yeah, in terms of the law, so your understanding is completely correct. Ultimately, there is a law that's currently being processed through Parliament as we speak. That legislation will put a legal duty on the parole board to take into consideration cases like ours where a body is missing. That said, as proven, the spirit of the law was applied in the case of Ian Sims earlier on, back end of last year. That eventually led to his release earlier on this year, and the spirit of the law was also applied in the case of Russell Causley. And once again, we can see that killers will continue to be released in the future despite applying the spirit of the law.
The parole board, Neil, say that the panel is bound by law to focus solely on whether an offender's continued detention is necessary for the protection of the public. Parole reviews are undertaken thoroughly and with extreme care. So they believe he's not a danger to the public and therefore they are bound to honour his parole.
Yes, unfortunately, the European Court of Human Rights dictates that convicted killers who are over tariff have a legal right to freedom. So in terms of risk, it's acknowledged that my grandfather poses a physical risk to myself and an emotional risk to my mother. They believe that they can mitigate against that risk, partly due to his age, but also through restrictions and keeping him out of certain counties in the United Kingdom. Our argument is that my grandfather hasn't complied so far to any of the requests of the authorities. So what makes them believe that he's suddenly going to start listening and respecting now?
Why do you and your mother, I mean, your mother Samantha was a teenager when this happened. Why do you and she think that he won't tell you what he's done with Carol Packman's body?
Yeah, what we're seeing all too often in these cases ultimately is it's a control. It's a control tactic. Ultimately, it's the last card that my grandfather holds. He knows that we're desperate, absolutely desperate for this information, and he's doing his utmost to inflict as much trauma as possible and withhold that information for his own pleasure and his own gain. Which I think only demonstrates really exactly what we're saying, is that he hasn't changed, his stance hasn't changed from 1996 when my grandfather was first convicted through to 2004 when he won his appeal. He was subsequently reconvicted. And any period there throughout, ultimately, my grandfather has consistently changed his account, has given different accounts, and the police just don't trust him these days. The parole board recognise that my grandfather is an habitual liar and isn't to be trusted. And I think that, when we pull all of these strings, all these threads together, it builds quite a compelling case as to why my grandfather shouldn't be released. And of course, I should be doing my utmost in the next 21 days. I have until the 29th of this month to appeal that decision on the basis that it was either procedurally flawed or it's irrational and no other problem.
Sorry, has Niamh got trouble hearing me here? Right, sorry. If our viewers at home were on the parole board. Put that compelling case to us to see what way they would think. Tell us about your grandmother and the circumstances in which she lost her life.
Certainly. So my grandmother disappeared in 1985. My grandfather was investigated in 1993 for a life insurance fraud. It hit headlines. Many people will be familiar in terms of that case. And ultimately, it then transpired when my grandfather did disappear that my grandmother wasn't around. So in 1996, my grandfather was convicted of murder with no body on purely circumstantial evidence. We fast forward, as I say, to 2004. He won a High Court appeal. We were the first family in British legal history to convict someone twice of the same murder with no body. And then we fast forward 10 years. And we get to 2014. And in 2014, my grandfather uses his first ever parole hearing as an opportunity to tell the parole board exactly what he did with my grandmother. And that was that he dismembered her body in the back garden and burnt her over a period of 3 days. My grandfather maintained that account for 2 years. 2 years, Dorset police reinvestigated that crime. And throughout that period, we were continuously being battered and railroaded by the parole boards whilst they had consistent hearings year on year. So from 2014 to the present day, we're on 6 parole hearings. And in that same period, as I say, he initially said that he had burnt her over a period of 3 days. He maintained that account for 2 years. He then retracted that account and said that he had buried her in a beautiful and idyllic location. He would not disclose that location to us because he did not want her body to be exhumed. He then retracted that confession altogether 2 months later and said that he was a complete miscarriage of justice and he's never murdered anybody before. He maintained that until the 19th of June 2020, when my grandfather then stood in front of a parole board and said once again, he reverted back to his first ever account and said that he did burn her over a period of 3 days. However, he wasn't actually involved in the murder. That was a third party.
You say, Neil, that you've got until the 29th of September to appeal, just 18 days. How confident are you that you might be able to get this parole decision turned round?
Yeah, so since the reconsideration was brought in following John Warboy's inquiry, many of the viewers will be familiar with that. It was accepted that there had to be greater transparency between the parole board and the victims. There's been I believe there's been 250 requests and there's been 0 successful appeals. So in terms of the chances and the odds of me being able to successfully appeal this are pretty slim. And the reason being is that there isn't any transparency. We convict in an open court and we release in a closed court. And let me be very, very clear, there is no scrutiny. The parole board are a rule and a law to themselves.
Neil, thank you very much indeed. Neil believes there that his grandmother's killer, his grandfather, should not be freed until he says where his grandmother's body, where her remains actually are. What do you think?